Welcome to the inaugural broadcast of the Mars Theater on the Air. Back Alley Productions is pleased to present you with a stage play performed for your listening pleasure. Trifles by Susan Glassville has been adapted by Emma C. and Kaylee Smith. As with any production, we have announcements to make before the performance. First, thank you for joining us. We appreciate having the ability of performing for an audience. We would like to remind you that this is a free broadcast. However, we at the Mars Theater would be sincerely grateful if you would consider making a donation. Any amount you choose from $1 up will help us produce more entertainment at a time when we can't use our theater. It remains closed so we can do our part to keep the COVID-19 virus from spreading while we still continue supporting our community. At this time, we would like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Dr. David Boyle and the Lafayette Presbyterian Church, Robert and Stephen Wardlaw, Anna Calcutta, Joan Jones, and Richard Chandler. If you would like to add your name to our list of sponsors, please get in touch with us by email at backalleyperformances@gmail.com. We love performing and are happy to bring you this and other productions. It's our first of several plays we will have on the air soon. We would now like to introduce the voice actors you are about to hear who will bring the characters in the play Trifles to life. They are Jason Tenney as Mr. Hale, a neighboring farmer, Jessica Parker playing Mrs. Hale, the farmer's wife, Art Sanner is Mr. Peters, the sheriff, Holly Shively as Mrs. Peters, the sheriff's wife, and Chris Smith plays George Henderson, the county attorney. I am Emma C., your narrator. Our final announcement is this. We ask that you laugh when we are funny, cry when we are sad, and most of all, sit back and enjoy as Back Alley Productions puts Mars Theater on the air with Trifles. It's the dead of winter on the plains of Nebraska during the early part of the 20th century. 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, trudged through bone-biting snow to open the back door of a very isolated and forlorn-looking farmhouse. It's miles from the nearest town and seems almost completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but earth and sky. The house is the home of John Wright. Its back door opens directly into a gloomy kitchen. Everything about it looks out of order. The walls are covered with a faded wallpaper, and items scattered around the room makes it seem as if someone left there in a hurry, by accident. There are unwashed pans under the sink that uses an iron hand pump for water. Bread sits uncovered on the counter and not in the bread box. A dish towel lays limply on the wooden table. The only sign of recent activity is the glow of a small fire in the old cast iron stove. Sheriff Peters, Farmer Hale, and County Attorney Henderson stalk through the kitchen door together. Peters and Hale, the 2 middle-aged men, immediately go to warm themselves by the fire lit in the stove. Henderson hangs back and holds the door open for wives of the sheriff and the farmer, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. They both look bothered, even a touch scared. Mrs. Peters is a naturally nervous woman who is thin and drawn. Mrs. Hale has meat on her bones and usually a smile on her face, but not today and not now. County Attorney Henderson joins the other 2 men by the fire. The 2 women come in slowly and stand near each other.
This feels good. Well, come up to the fire, ladies.
Well, I'm not cold.
Now, Mr. Hale, before we move things about, you explain to Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
By the way, has anything been moved? Are things just where you left them yesterday?
It's just the same. When it dropped below zero last night, I thought I'd better send Frank out this morning to make a fire for us. No use getting pneumonia with a big case on, but I told him not to touch anything except the stove. And you know Frank.
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday? When I had to send Frank to Morris Center for that man who went crazy? I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get back from Omaha by today, and as long as I went over everything here myself.
Well, Mr. Hale, tell just what happened when you came here yesterday morning.
Harry and I had started in town with a load of potatoes. Came along the road from my place, and as I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself. But I thought maybe if I went to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I said to Harry that I didn't know as what his wife wanted made much difference to John.
Let's talk about that later, Mr. Hill. I do want to talk about that, but tell now just what happened when you got to the house.
I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they must be up. It was past 8 o'clock. So I knocked again, and I thought I heard somebody say, come in. I wasn't sure. I'm not sure yet, but I opened the door, this door. And there in that rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
All five stop and stare silently at the rocker.
What was she doing?
She was rocking back and forth. She had her apron in her hand and was kind of pleating it.
And how did she look?
Well, she looked queer.
How do you mean queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next, and kind of done up.
How did she seem to feel about your coming?
I don't think she minded one way or other. She didn't pay much attention. I said, how do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it? And she said, is it? And went on kind of pleading at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or sit down, but just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, I want to see John. And then she laughed. I guess you would call it a laugh. I thought of Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, can't I see John? No, she says, kind of dull-like. Ain't he home, says I? Yes, says she, he's home. Why can't I see him? I asked her. Out of patience. Because he's dead, says she. Dead, says I. She just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, but rocking back and forth. Why, where is he, says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs like that. I got up with the idea of going up there. I walked from there to here, then I says, why, what did he die of? He died of a rope round his neck, says she, and just went on pleading at her apron. Well, I went and called Harry. I thought I might need help. Went upstairs, and there he was lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs where you can point it all out. Just go on now with the rest of the story.
Well, my first thought was to get that rope off. It looked... But Harry, he went up to him and he said, no, he's dead, all right, and we better not touch anything. So we went back downstairs. She was still sitting that same way. Has anybody been notified, I asked. No, says she, unconcerned. Who did this, Mrs. Wright, said Harry. He said it businesslike. She stopped pleading of her apron. I don't know, she says. You don't know, says Harry. No, she says. Weren't you sleeping in the bed with him, says Harry. Yes, says she, but I was on the inside. Somebody slipped a rope round his neck and strangled him, and you didn't wake up, says Harry. I didn't wake up, she said. We must have looked as if we didn't know how that could be, for after a minute she said, I sleep sound. Harry was going to ask for more questions, but I said maybe we ought to let her tell her story first to the coroner or the sheriff. So Harry went fast as he could to Rivers' place, where there's a telephone.
And what did Miss Wright do when she knew that you had gone for the coroner?
She moved from that chair to this one over here and just sat there with her hands held together and looking down. I got a feeling that I ought to make some conversation, so I said I had come to see if John wanted to put in on telephone. And at that, she started to laugh. And then she stopped and looked at me, scared. I don't know. Maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say it was. Soon Harry got back, and then Dr. Lloyd, and you and Miss Peters. So I guess that's all I know that you don't.
Well, I guess we'll go upstairs first and then out to the barn and around there. You're convinced that there was nothing important here, nothing that would point to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
County Attorney Henderson is young and unmarried. He looks around the kitchen, then opens the door of a cupboard closet. He pulls a chair over so he can stand on it and look at the top shelf. He touches it and pulls away with something red and sticky on his palm.
Well, here's a mess.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. Well, she worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire'd go out and her jars would break.
Well, can you beat the women? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves.
I guess before we're through, she may have something more serious than preserves to worry about.
Well, women are used to worrying over trifles.
And yet, for all their worries, what would we do without the ladies?
The county attorney climbs down and goes to the sink and gets a dipper full of water from the pail and pours it into the basin to wash his hands. He reaches for the roller towel and turns it several times looking for a clean spot.
Dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, would you say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
Oh, to be sure. And yet, I know there were some Dixon County farmhouses which do not have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick. Men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Ah, loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Miss Wright were neighbors. I suppose you were friends, too?
I've not seen much of her of late years. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why was that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson. And then
Yes.
it never seemed like a very cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had either.
You mean that they didn't get on very well?
No, I don't mean anything. But I don't think a place'd be any cheerfuler for John Wright's being in it.
Well, I'd like to talk more of that a little later. I want to get the lay of things upstairs now.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was to take in some clothes for, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
Yes, but I would like to see what you take, Mrs. Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that might be of use to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
The two women listen as the men's voices disappear upstairs. They are left alone in the cold, unkempt, dreary kitchen. Mrs. Hill quickly starts to straighten the pots and pans that clang to the floor when the county attorney kicks them.
I'd hate to have men coming into my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
Now, of course, it's no more than their duty.
Well, duty's all right, but I guess that deputy sheriff that came out to make the fire might have got a little of this on. Oh, I wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having things slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry.
Mrs. Peters, who has been looking through cupboards, lifts one end of a towel that covers a pan.
She had bread set.
Mrs. Hale steps closer to Mrs. Peters. She moves slowly, as if underwater, toward the loaf of bread.
She was going to put this in there.
She picks the bread up, then drops it abruptly.
It's a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone.
Mrs. Hale then goes to the chair County Attorney Henderson used to look at the cupboard's top shelf for herself.
There's some fruit here that's all right, Mrs. Peters. Yes, here. This is cherries, too. Well, I declare I believe that's the only one. Well, she'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
The farmer's wife brings the jar of preserves to the big kitchen table next to the rocking chair. She sighs and almost sits in the chair, then freezes, remembering the last woman who occupied it.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet. You coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You could help me carry them.
The two housewives go into the next room. When they return, the sheriff's wife carries a petticoat, dress, and skirt over her arm. Mrs. Hale has a pair of shoes. Mrs. Peters lays the clothes on the big kitchen table, then hurries to the stove.
Oh, my, it's cold in there.
Right was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. I suppose she felt she couldn't do her part. And then you don't always enjoy things when you feel shabby. Oh, she used to wear pretty clothes and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. But that was 30 years ago. Oh, this all you was to take in?
Well, she said she wanted an apron. Funny thing to want there isn't much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose just to make her feel more natural. Well, she said they was in the top drawer in this cupboard. Yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door. Yes, here it is.
Mrs. Peters.
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
Do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for an apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. And Mr. Henderson is an awful sarcastic in his speech, and he'll make fun of her saying she didn't wake up.
Well, I guess John Wright didn't wake when they was slipping that rope under his neck.
No, it's strange. It must have been done awful crafty and still. They say it was such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. There was a gun in the house. He says that's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said coming out that what was needed for the case was a motive, something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, I don't see any signs of anger around here.
The farmer's wife, Mrs. Hale, puts her hand on a dish towel which lies on the kitchen table. She looks down at the table and sees half of it is clean and the other half messy.
Oh, it's wiped to here.
She moves as if to finish the work, then stops and slowly turns to look at the loaf of bread not placed in the bread box.
I wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. You know, it seems kind of sneaking, locking her up in town, and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
I suppose it is. Better loosen up your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
The sheriff's wife, Mrs. Peters, takes off her jacket and walks across the room to hang it on a hook on the far wall. By the rocker, she sees a large sewing basket with bright pieces of cloth.
She was piecing a quilt.
It's a log cabin pattern. Pretty, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
They wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Well, let's go out to the barn and get that cleared up.
I don't know as there's anything so strange. Our taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course, they've got awful important things on their minds.
Mrs. Peters, look at this one. Here, this is the one she was working on, and look at the sewing. All the rest of it has been so nice and even, and look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks as if she didn't know what she was about.
The women look nervously toward the back door and then to each other. Mrs. Hale, in an instant, starts pulling at the uneven stitching on the quilt. She then gets a needle from the sewing basket.
What are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Just pulling out a stitch or two that's not sewed very good. Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish up this end. Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. Well, I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes sew awful queer when I'm just tired. Oh, well, now, I must get these things wrapped up. They may be through sooner than we think. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string.
In that cupboard, maybe.
What? Here's the bird cage.
Huh.
Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
Well, I don't know whether she did or not. I've not been here for so long. There was a man around last year selling canaries cheap, but I don't know if she took one. Maybe she did. Oh, she used to sing real pretty herself.
Seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one. Why would she have a cage? Wonder what happened to it.
I suppose maybe the cat got it.
Oh, no, she didn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. Oh, my cat got in her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
Well, my sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
The two women examined the bird cage. It's small and made of hand-woven wicker. The little copper swing dangles from the center. Everything about the cage looks normal, except for the door.
Oh, it's broke.
Oh.
One hinge is pulled completely apart.
Well, it looks as if someone might have been rough with it.
Well, yes.
Mrs. Peters moves the bird cage to the kitchen table.
Oh, I wish if they were going to find any evidence, they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
Oh, but I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. Oh, it would be lonesome for me sitting here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I had come over sometimes when I wish I had.
Well, but of course, you were awful busy, Mrs. Hale. Your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful, and that's why I ought to have come. I never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a holler where you don't see the road. I don't know what it is, but it's a lonesome place and always was. I wish I had come over to see Minnie sometimes. Oh, I can see now.
Well, now, you mustn't reproach yourself, Mrs. Hale. Well, somehow, you just don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes less work, but it does make a quiet house. And ride out to work all day and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. Well, they say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink. He kept his word as well as most, I guess, and paid his debts. But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Why, just to pass the time of day with him, oh, it's like a raw wind that gets to the bone. I should think she wanted a bird. But what do you suppose went with it?
I don't know. Well, unless it got sick and died.
There's an odd, strained silence as Mrs. Peters takes her finger, reaches into the cage, and pushes the broken swing, watching it go back and forth.
You weren't raised round here, were you? You didn't know her.
Well, not till they brought her yesterday.
She, come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but kind of timid and fluttery. Oh, how she did change. Tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind.
Well, now, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't possibly be any objection to it, could there?
Mm-mm.
I mean, well, now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches are in here and her things.
Well, here's some red. Oh, I expect this has sewing things in it. Well, what a pretty box.
Aw.
Looks like something somebody would give you.
Mhm.
Maybe her scissors are in here. Oh, why, Mrs. Peters, there's something wrapped up in this piece of silk.
She suddenly holds her nose and turns away, almost gagging, as the foul odor of death and decay rises into the air. Mrs. Peters bends near, then also jerks away as the stench reaches her face.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Oh, Mrs. Peters, it's... Oh, but Mrs. Peters, look at it. Look at its neck. Look at its neck. It's all... Oh, other side too.
Somebody wrung its neck.
Their eyes meet. A look of growing comprehension, sadness, and horror spreads over the face of each. The men's footsteps are heard outside.
Oh.
Mrs. Hale quickly slips the box under the quilting pieces, then sinks into her chair at the table as the sheriff and county attorney return. Mrs. Peters remains standing.
Well, ladies, have you decided whether she was going to quilt it or knot it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Has the bird flown?
We think the cat got it.
Oh, is there a cat?
Mrs. Hale gives Mrs. Peters a quick side-eye glance. It goes unnoticed by the men.
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
Well, no sign at all of anyone who can come from outside. Their own rope. Now, let's go up again and go over it piece by piece. It would have had to have been someone who knew just...
Mrs. Peters sinks into another chair across the table from Mrs. Hale. Neither woman looks at the other.
She likes the bird. Oh, she was gonna bury it in that pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, well, there was a boy that took a hatchet, and before my eyes,
Oh,
before I could get there, oh, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have any children around. No, Wright wouldn't like the bird. A thing that sang. She used to sing. He killed that too.
Now, we don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
Oh, it was an awful thing was done in this house, Mrs. Hale. killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
The farmer's wife gently touches the birdcage.
His neck. Choked the life out of him.
Oh, now, we don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there'd been years and years of nothing, then a bird sing to you, it would be awful still. After the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota and my first baby died, well, after he was 2 years old and me with no other than...
How soon do you suppose they'll be through looking for the evidence?
Oh, I know what stillness is.
Let's see.
Oh, but now the law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and stood up there in the choir and sang. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. And who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how things can be for women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live so close together, and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's all just a different kind of the same thing. Oh, if I was you, I wouldn't tell her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take this in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
Oh, my. It's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Wouldn't they just laugh? Getting all stirred up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with, well, wouldn't they laugh?
Maybe they would. Maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters, it's all perfectly clear, except a reason for doing it. But you know juries when it comes to women. If there was some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about, a thing that would connect up with the strange way of doing it.
Well, I got the team around. It's pretty cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take in?
Oh, I guess there are not very dangerous things the ladies have picked out. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. You ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law. I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hale.
Mr. Hale leaves through the back door. The sheriff and the county attorney go to the bedroom. For a brief moment, the women are alone in the kitchen. Thoughtfully, as if in prayer, Mrs. Hale has pressed her hands together. She stares fervently at Mrs. Peters and gestures with her head to show where the box containing the dead bird is hidden. Rapidly, before the men can make it back down, she opens the box and reaches in just to grab the body of the dead bird, but she just can't force herself to touch it. At first, she stands frozen and helpless. Then she falls to pieces as the sound of a doorknob is heard. The men are coming down the stairs. Like lightning, Mrs. Hale snatches the box from Mrs. Peters. She closes the cover on the pretty box and puts it in her big coat just as County Attorney Henderson and Sheriff Peters walk into the room.
Well, Henry, at least we found out that she was not going to quilt it. She was going Oh, what is it you call it, ladies?
We call it not it, Mr. Henderson.